reading from Alice in Wonderland. And I'd like to go back to Alice in Wonderland because it just really, I think, points out the absurdity of where we are at this point. We think of Lewis Carroll as being fiction. Of course it's fiction. We think, Alice never fell down a rabbit hole. Of course she didn't. She's not real. The White Queen and her caustic judgments, they're not really a threat to us. But there is a question, has America the Beautiful become Alice's Wonderland? We can hear the Queen saying, no, no. But her response is sentence first, verdict afterwards. Well, that's absurd. How could we sentence someone without determining first whether they're guilty or innocent? Only in Alice's Wonderland would you sentence someone before you try them. Would you sentence someone to death before you accuse them? Do we really live in Alice's Wonderland? Is there no one willing to stand up and say to the president, for goodness sakes, you can't sentence people before you try them. You can't sentence people before you've determined whether they're guilty. There's been discussion in our country about whether even the courts can sometimes make mistakes. Some states have gotten rid of the death penalty because they've made mistakes and they've, through DNA testing, found out they sometimes convicted the wrong person. Can you imagine, with all the checks and balances of our court system, which I think is the best in the entire world, with attorneys on both sides, whether you can afford one or not, there's an argument back and forth, and you have all these procedural protections, and you can appeal, and still sometimes we get it wrong. If we can get it wrong in the best system in the world, do you think one politician might get it wrong? But you'll never know because nobody's told who's going to be killed. It's a secret list. So how do you protest? How do you say I'm innocent? How do you say, yes, I email with my cousin who lives in the Middle East and I didn't know he was involved in that? Do you not get a chance to explain yourself in a court of law before you get a hellfire missile dropped on your head? So I think we really, it just amazes me that people are so willing and eager to throw out the Bill of Rights and just say, oh, that's fine. Terrorists are a big threat to us. And, I'm so fearful that they will attack me that I'm willing to give up my rights. I'm willing to give up on the Bill of Rights. I think we give up too easily. Now, the president has responded, and he said he hasn't killed anybody yet in America. And he says he doesn't intend to kill anyone in America, but he might. I frankly just don't think that's good enough. The president's oath of office says that I will, not that I might, or not that I intend to. The president says I will protect, preserve, and defend the Constitution. He doesn't say I'll do it when it's practical, or I'll do it unless it's infeasible, unless it's unpleasant and people argue with me and I have to go through Congress and I can't get anything done, then I won't obey the Constitution. It's out there. It's a rule. He doesn't get to choose. Recently, he made some choices where it appears as if he believes that he does have some sort of superpower, some power that sort of exceeds the other branches of government. Recently, he told the body of the Senate that he decides when we're in recess, that he decides when we're working. The court rebuked him, and the court told him that it's unconstitutional, and they reversed his decision. And do you know the people that he appointed through a recess that he made up? Do you know what they're doing right now? They're still at their post. They're still working in defiance of the court. So this will have to go to the Supreme Court. I guess it takes another year or so to go up there. But he's been told what he did was illegal. But I guess what disappoints me most about this, though, is that, the president, when he ran for office, was someone who actually I had a great deal of respect for him on the issues of civil liberties. I work with many on the other side of the aisle because, frankly, many on the left and some on the right, actually, we truly do believe in civil liberties and protecting the individual. And I think the president was one of those when he was in the Senate. The president, when he ran for office, often talked about that it isn't American to torture people. I agreed with him. He said it isn't American to give up on the right to privacy, to say that you don't need a warrant to tap someone's phone, and I agreed with him, and I respected that about him. But I can't for the life of me understand how he goes from that kind of belief, where he believes so much in the constitutional protections to your phone, but he's not willing to stand up for the constitutional protection to your life. It just doesn't make any sense at all. And if he does, why won't he say it? I have my own sort of theory on this, and this applies both to Republicans and Democrats. My theory is that it's sort of a contagion. It's sort of an infection that you get when occupying the Oval Office. They think, oh, I'm a good person, so more power for me would be a good thing. But Lord Acton said that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. There is a danger when someone has so much power that they think more power and more power and more power, I will do good with that power. The problem is that even if that is a good person, someday someone occupying that office may not be a good person. Someday you may get someone in the Oval Office who says, what about those people? They look different than us. What about those people? They have different color skin. What about those people? They have a different color ideology than I have. What about those people? The danger is also that we've already defined some of the people who we think might be terrorists. The Bureau of Justice came out with a list of characteristics, and they said, if you see this, report on it. See this, tell someone. They want you to inform on your neighbor, so you have to know which one of my neighbors is a terrorist. So they gave you some descriptions of people to be worried about. They said people missing fingers, people with colored stains on their clothes, people who have weatherized ammunition, people who have multiple guns, people who like to use cash. If that's the criteria or the criterion for who is a terrorist, I'd be a little bit worried that if you're one of those people, you might have a drone attack you in your bed tonight. This has gone on in more than one place. The fusion centers they developed were supposed to be liaison between the federal government and the local government. In these fusion centers, for example, in Missouri, they also came up with some characteristics of people who might be terrorists. They actually sent it out as a memo to all the police officers. Can you imagine if you're one of these people? People who are pro-life, people who are for secure borders, people who support third-party candidates. And the big irony of all is people who belong to the Constitution Party. So if you believe in the Constitution too much, you might be a terrorist. Now they say it was a mistake, and they eventually apologized, and now they try not to have their memos become public, I think. But the point is that if this is what we're getting to, and this is the criterion for who is a terrorist, you would think, you really would think that you'd be worried about giving your president the authority to kill Americans on American soil without any kind of due process. So I find it quite alarming. I think the answer, that he could have given is pretty simple. I think there's a possibility even that his answer, that he actually may even agree with some of the things we're saying here today. But why won't he give it? I think presidents, Republican and Democrat, don't give the answer because they're afraid of constricting their authority at all. They believe in some sort of inherent power that's not listed anywhere, but they just think they've got it. And they don't want to give up any of it. They jealously guard their power. So they have this power and they don't want to give it up. And so that's why they won't answer us with a straight answer. So you get things that the only word I can think of it is gobbledygook. You get this craziness that comes from attorneys that makes no sense. So when he was asked, what is an imminent threat? These people that we're going to kill with drones have to be an imminent threat. But his attorneys say, well, imminent doesn't have to mean immediate. That's the only way they can justify it, because probably half of these drone attacks are people who really aren't engaged in any kind of combat. That's a different debate. You can argue right or wrong whether we should be killing these people not involved in combat because there's evidence they are conspiring to hurt us and to attack us. That's another argument. But it's a pretty low standard. And you can argue, well, that's war over there and that's a lower standard. I can accept it. But for goodness sakes, could there be any question that in America we're going to accept a standard so low, a standard that basically says that if we think you might someday be engaged in hostilities, we can kill you? We have to be careful because the criteria for the drone strike program overseas really is something that I think most Americans wouldn't accept for their fellow citizens. Overseas, one of the most famous American citizens they killed was Al-Awlaki. Before he was killed, he was primarily killed as someone who they said was a sympathizer. I think there's no question he's a sympathizer. He, I think, denounced his citizenship. He was a bad guy. He sympathized with our enemies. And I think he could have been tried for treason. I think if I were on the jury, from what I've read of the non-classified information, I would have voted for his guilt and for his death. But the thing is, some kind of process might be helpful. His son, though, 16 years old, was killed 2 weeks later in a separate drone strike, and he was on nobody's list that I know of. They won't respond. But I think the response by the president's spokesman is reprehensible and really should be called out. I mean, it's sort of this flippant response that I think shows absolutely no regard for individual rights or for Americans. He said, well, the kid should have chosen a more responsible father. Think about that. Is that the standard that you wish your government to operate on in America? We got a lot of criminals in our country. We got a lot of bad people. If you happen to be the son of a bad person, is that enough to kill you? The other thing is that people killed overseas that are not the target, they don't call them civilians because they say anybody between the age of 16 and 50 that's a male is a potential combatant. Are we going to use that same standard here in our country? Are we going to use the standard in our country that if you just happen to be a male and you happen to be standing near somebody that we've judged to be a problem, that you're going to go ahead and, oh, I guess that's not even collateral damage. That person was probably a bad person because he was standing close to this person. I think there are different standards for war than there are for within our country. And it's not always going to be perfect, and there is legitimate debate over what the rules should be in a war, where a war is overseas, and exactly what happens. And I think good, honest people can disagree on some of that. But what I worry about are the people who say that America's a battlefield. Because when they say America's a battlefield, they say that they want the laws of war to apply here. Which the reverse of that is basically, if you reverse the laws of war, they're talking about martial law is what they're talking about. Law that's acceptable under extreme circumstances. I don't think what we have in our country right now is a circumstance where I would accept martial law. But we've already instituted some of the things that you'll see in other countries under martial law. In Egypt, they have indefinite detention. That's their emergency decree that occurred back in the 1950s. And it went on and on, maybe not 50s, 70s, went on and on to the present. And so you have martial law, and they were very unhappy about having martial law, indefinite detention. Well, you got it last year. We have indefinite detention in America. And the president's response, again, was inadequate. What did the president say to having indefinite detention in our country? He said, well, I don't intend to use it. Well, I'd rather have a president who has the chutzpah to not sign the legislation and send it back and say, take it out or I won't sign it. I would have a lot of respect for someone like that. Mr. President, without yielding the floor, I'd be happy to entertain a question from the senator from Texas.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I wanted to come to the floor to pose a few questions to my colleague from Kentucky. But first to say I admire his fortitude and his willingness to ask appropriate and reasonable questions of the administration on a matter of grave importance. This is no less important than our constitutional government itself, that does not give sole power to the administration to make decisions, but recognizes that the Congress is a co-equal branch of government. And indeed, we have important oversight responsibilities of the Department of Justice, the Department of Defense, and there isn't any more delicate and important matter than the limitations placed on the government when it comes to dealing with our own citizens. So I would just, I'd like to ask the senator from Kentucky whether he's aware of some of these issues. First of all, shortly after President Obama took office, the Holder Justice Department declassified and released detailed, previously top secret legal memos attempting to explain the legal rationale for the enhanced interrogation program that the Central Intelligence Agency used during the Bush administration. Now, these memos were written by the Office of Legal Counsel at the Department of Justice, which is frequently called the lawyer for the executive branch, who issues those authoritative memos. But President Obama, Eric Holder, presumably decided that they would release those previously classified memos that explain the legal rationale for the enhanced interrogation program. And I'd further ask the senator if he recalls that when the Obama administration made these legal memos, highly classified legal memos, public documents, does he remember that the Attorney General made some specific comments? He said, quote, "We're disclosing these memos consistent with our commitment to the rule of law," close quote. Yet today, the same Justice Department refuses to release to members of Congress, including this senator, the senator from Kentucky, and other members who have oversight responsibilities, the very same legal rationale in this case for the drone strikes that the senator for Kentucky is talking about. So I wanted to ask, first of all, the senator of Kentucky whether he believes I've accurately recited the facts, but then to ask him whether he sees a double standard here on the part of the Obama Holder Justice Department, where on one hand they release these legal memos from the Office of Legal Counsel, and in this case, instead of releasing the legal rationale for the authority to make drone strikes, they issue what's in essence a white paper or a press release that was leaked to the news media. So I would ask the senator from Kentucky to respond.
Mr. President, the question from the senator from Texas is a very good one, and there does seem to be a double standard going on here. There seems to be one standard for wiretapping of phones or interrogation, but seems to be a much less of a standard for actually killing. And it seems to be hypocritical, and you would wonder why. With regard to releasing the memos on how they come about their process, some of that was leaked. It's always curious to me. It seems almost as if the leaks come on purpose, as if they were intentional, the leaks that happen right before a nomination process. I don't know the truth of that. But I do think that not only should we get the memos, but if there's going to be a drone strike program in America, perhaps we should actually be writing the rules and sending them to the president, and that would be our job, not to listen to him on what he's going to do with drone strikes in America, but actually to spelling out and having an open discussion, because in America, I don't think that should be a secret. How we're going to go about this in America. So I see no reason not only to get the drone memos, and I think it would be more consistent with their earlier position, but I think what we should do is really be a part of the process of determining how we go forward with, if we're going to have drone strikes in America, what the rules would be.
President, would the senator yield for another question?
Senator from Texas.
I would just ask further of the senator from Kentucky. I believe the question that he has asked, whether the president has the power to authorize lethal force, such as a drone strike against a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil and without trial, is a very clearly stated question, and one to which I believe the senator and the rest of the members of Congress are entitled to a very clear answer. I was in the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing with the Attorney General this morning when we attempted to ask him on a number of occasions what his answer would be to this question, and yet he equivocated. He was ambiguous. He seemed to be ambiguous when a clear answer would serve him just as well, as the point the senator from Kentucky has made. But the question I have for the senator is that wouldn't it, in all likelihood, the legal rationale or justification issued by the Office of Legal Counsel at the Department of Justice likely include a discussion which would illuminate and elucidate the answer to the senator's question? In other words, I would assume, without having seen that classified memo, that it would go through a rather lengthy analysis of the hypothetical situations under which these drone strikes might be used, and would, in all likelihood, I think, shed some light on and clarify the answer to the senator's question. Wouldn't that be a reasonable way to answer what is a very straightforward and reasonable question?
Mr. President, one of the things that actually, even piecing together what I've heard of some of his testimony, he did finally admit to some things that I think are consistent with what I'm saying. They haven't put it in writing previously. I would think that he could almost take his testimony today, where it almost at some point seems to agree that it would be unconstitutional to kill non-combatants, people not actively engaged in combat. If he would say that, I think he would answer my question, basically, because I've never been talking about people engaged in lethal force. There's always, you really don't get much due process if you're engaged in lethal force is used against you. So you would think if he would just answer that simple question, similar to what he actually started in the testimony, but they won't give us a succinct answer or any answer, really. And so that's the answer we've been trying to get all along.
If the senator will yield for one last question.
From the senator from Texas.
To the senator's last point, I'm reading from a letter dated March the 4th from the Attorney General to Senator Paul, where he says, and I quote, "The question you have posed is entirely hypothetical, unlikely to occur, and one would hope that no president will ever have to confront." But he goes on to say, in response to Senator Paul's question, it is possible, I suppose, to imagine an extraordinary circumstance in which it would be necessary and appropriate under the Constitution and applicable laws of the United States for the President to authorize the military to use lethal force within the territory of the United States. In other words, to the senator's point, on one hand, he said it would be a hypothetical question, unlikely to occur, and one we hope no president would ever have to confront. And then on the other hand, he said it is possible to imagine a scenario under which it would happen. So appearing to say, cast further lack of clarity on something that should be a straightforward yes or no.
Mr. President, the interesting thing about saying it's hypothetical and it wouldn't happen, I could buy that, except for the fact that our foreign drone strike program, a significant amount of the drone strikes are on people not actively engaged in combat. So whether that's right or wrong is another question, but since we already have an example of a significant amount of those not engaged in active combat, it's hard for him to say that this is a rare, unusual, hypothetical thing that could never happen, because it seems like it's a big part of the drone program overseas.
I said that was my last question, Mr. President. I'd ask the senator to yield for. This will be my last question. It strikes me, Mr. President, that there is a clear double standard here. The senator's asked a reasonable question to which he has not gotten a clear answer, and one that's clearly within the purview of the United States Senate in their oversight capacity for the Department of Justice and as a co-equal branch of government. But on one hand, the Obama-Holder Justice Department not just released a white paper, but released previously classified legal memos from the Office of Legal Counsel on the enhanced interrogation program, saying that it was consistent with their commitment to the rule of law. And today, in response to an eminently reasonable request, is giving the senator from Kentucky what can adequately, I think, appropriately be called the Heisman or stiff arm. and denying him access to that. So I just wanted to come to the floor and make that point and ask those questions and say again, I admire the senator's fortitude and willingness to stand up and challenge the administration on this issue. It would be easy to satisfy the senator's request. He's made that very clear. He is not intending to block a vote on this nomination, but he is intending to get the information that he has requested, and he's entitled to it.
Mr. President, the questions and points the senator from Texas have made are very good points. And it also shows you that we're really not that far apart on trying to find an answer to this, because really there is no ultimate ability of me to stop this nomination. I'm already getting tired, and I don't know how long I'll be able to do this. So I can't ultimately stop the nomination. But what I can do is try to draw attention to this and try to get an answer. That would be something if we could get an answer from the president, and I think we'd all sleep better and feel more comfortable if he would say explicitly that non-combatants in America won't be killed with drones. The reason it has to be answered is because our foreign drone strike program does kill non-combatants. Now, they may argue that they're conspiring or that they may someday be combatants, but if that's the same standard we're going to use in the United States, it's a far different country than I know about. Ours is a country where dissent, vocal dissent, even vehement, vociferous dissent as far as whether our country should go to war, whether our country should raise taxes, lowers taxes. We've always allowed a great deal of dissent in our country. But some of the people who we've said we're targeting have been dissenters, probably traitors too, but they've also been people who have been vocalizing it more than they've been shooting anybody. Now, it's not to say you can't be a traitor even if you don't shoot anybody, but if you're going to be accused of treason or being a traitor in the United States, I would think you get your day in court probably. It's particularly troublesome since some of the descriptions of who might be a terrorist are such that, I'd be a little bit concerned about the slippery slope to who is and who isn't a terrorist. And I just can't imagine in America we would do that without an open accusation, without a trial by a jury, without a verdict. So I think it is important that this discussion go on. And I'm not really ultimately setting the goal that I can stop this nomination. I'm here today to draw attention to a constitutional principle, to try to get the administration to admit publicly that they will not kill Americans who are not involved in combat. But really it hasn't have so much to do with Brennan or with his nomination. It has to do with the constitutional principle. And ultimately Brennan will be approved. He will be the head of the CIA. This will be a blip in his nomination process. But I hope people will see it more as an argument for how important our rights are, that really no branch of government, no individual politician should be above that law, should be able to dictate and say what they think the law is. Now, we had some of this even under a Republican president. I was critical of President Bush for saying that he had the ability to interpret the law. He had the ability to put signing statements, which were extensive sometimes, which gave his interpretation of what the law was or what he thought the law was. So I've been critical of both sides, thinking they have more power than they have. Our founding fathers were brilliant in the sense that when they separated the powers and had these co-equal powers of government, these branches of government that were somewhat pitted against each other, and by having equal power and by being able to judge the power of the other branch, no one branch could accumulate too much power. But in our country, it's been going the other way for a long time. It hasn't been just Democrat presidents or just Republican presidents. It's frankly been both. For maybe 100 years or so, power's been gravitating and gravitating and gravitating and going to the presidency. Not just the presidency. When people talk about the bureaucracy, these are people who are within the executive branch, millions of them. When we passed Obamacare, it was 2,000 some odd pages. There have been 9,000 pages of regulations written since. Obamacare had 1,800 references to the Secretary of Health shall decide at a later date. We gave up that power. We gave up power that should have been ours, that should have been written into the legislation. We gave up that power. And as a consequence, we gave it to the executive branch. We gave it to people who, many of them, who we call bureaucrats, are unelected. So we gave away power. It is a struggle, and it should be a perpetual struggle. But we shouldn't give in on that struggle and give up that power. So right now, there was mention that the president should reveal to us drone memos on how he's making the decisions. We've had some leaks about that, but I would go one step further. Not only should the president let Congress know what he's doing, maybe we should tell him what to do. Maybe the Congress should be setting the rules for how we do drone strikes. Maybe the Congress should be protecting the American people from their government. That sounds, oh, that's terrible, protecting you from your government. That's what the Constitution was about. The Constitution wasn't written to restrain your behavior. It was written to restrain your government's behavior. A lot of people get confused when we talk about, religion and the First Amendment. But if you read the First Amendment, it says Congress shall make no law. It doesn't say anything about your religious preferences. It's not supposed to limit your involvement in government. It's really not supposed to limit so much religious involvement in government or even religion. We have a prayer every morning here in the Senate. You can't have it in your public school, but we have a prayer every morning. Explain that to me. We've got the 10th Amendment around, the 10 Commandments around here, so do, I think Supreme Court has it, but you can't have it in your local school. I think we kind of got confused on things. It was really about government getting involved in your religion. Now, we didn't want to establish a church. We thought it was a bad idea to have an official church, and I still think it's a bad idea to have an official church because then the government would be telling the church what to do. But it's really all about the documents that we have protecting you from an overbearing government. Your government was given a few defined powers, the enumerated powers. There's 17, 19, depends on how you want to count them, but there's not very many. They're few and defined. But your liberties are many, basically unlimited and undefined. When you read the 9th and 10th Amendment, it says that those rights not explicitly given to government are left to the states and the people. They're yours. They're not to be disparaged. These are important debates we're having. When Montesquieu talked about the separation of powers and the different checks and balances, he said, there can be no liberty when you combine the executive and the legislative. Likewise, I would add to that, there can be no liberty when you combine the executive and the judiciary. So if you allow the president to tell you that he can have drone strikes on Americans on American soil, you're allowing him to be not only the executive, you're allowing him to be the judiciary. And if he makes it secret, nobody really can object. I remember one time I was complaining to another senator about these things called suspicious activity reports. Your bank is required to file them on you. In fact, if you do a wire transfer, if you pay your Visa bill through your bank over the phone, you've done a wire transfer and you can be a part of a suspicious activity report. If you turn cash into the bank or get cash out of the bank over a certain amount, you can get a suspicious activity report. But I was concerned about this because there have been 8 million of them filed since 9/11. And the senator's response was he's never heard anybody complain about it. The reason you don't complain is they're secret. They don't tell you they're doing this. So if you get on the kill list, it's a little hard to complain. So we might have a kill list for a couple of years in the United States on American citizens, and nobody might complain because it's secret. You don't know you're on the list. So I think it is important that we have a big debate and discussion over this, that we let the president know he doesn't get to write all these rules on killing American citizens, that the Constitution still applies in our country. The reason this is a big debate is that when you're in a war, the Constitution doesn't always apply on the battlefield in another country. There's a debate over whether the Constitution is here or whether it extends beyond the borders, but practical matter is we can't really enforce the Constitution beyond our borders. You've sort of consented to your Constitution. You sort of consent to your government by voting. And we have that arrangement in our country, but it doesn't really happen in Mexico or Europe or Afghanistan. It certainly doesn't happen in the middle of hostilities. So you really don't get due process over there. But that's the real danger. That's the problem here. That's the rub. This whole thing is about the use of authorization of force that was passed after 9/11 to go to war in Afghanistan. If you had voted on that, you didn't, your leaders did, but had you voted on that, you'd have thought, I'm going to war in Afghanistan to get the people who attacked us on 9/11. I was all for it. I think that was something we needed to do. We couldn't let people attack us. But I don't think you would have thought when you voted for that you were voting for a worldwide war with no end that included America as part of the battlefield. And that's the real problem here. The administration, John Brennan, who wants to be head of the CIA, Eric Holder, head of the Attorney General, they all believe, and many here believe this also, that there's no geographic limit to the war. It's not in Afghanistan. They say it's everywhere, but they say everywhere includes here. Here's the problem. If you don't think you can apply due process in the middle of a war, what happens if they say the war's here? That means you don't get any protection. So if you're accused of a crime, I guess that's it. I can't imagine that that's what we want as Americans. I just can't imagine that we would believe that or acquiesce or allow the president basically to say, you know, he's going to make the decisions for us. That basically he would kill non-combatants in America. I frankly think eventually he will admit. It'd be nice if he'd admit tonight that he's not going to do it. If anybody's got a phone, give him a call, let him know. We'd like to know an answer. And I think it would be appropriate. But when the Attorney General came this morning to the Judiciary Committee to answer questions, he was asked repeatedly this question. Can you kill non-combatants if they're sitting and having tea somewhere in America? And he kind of weebled and wobbled and went around the issue. And then finally they said, we want to know, is it constitutional or not? Do you think you can do this? Instead of saying, we might not, we don't intend to. And it sounds like he finally admits in the end that it is unconstitutional. But then why can't we get them to issue a statement? Why can't we get them to say explicitly, we're not going to do this? I see no reason. It would take them 5 minutes to jot this down on a piece of paper. If they don't intend to do it, why not tell us? When your government won't tell you they're not going to do something, when they won't answer, no, I don't have the power, they're saying to you, yes, I have the power. If they will not answer your question and say, no, I will not kill Americans who are not involved in combat here at home, if they cannot tell you that, they are saying, yes, they will kill Americans not involved in combat. It's a simple question. Connor Friedersdorf writes for The Atlantic, and he writes, does President Obama think that he has the power to kill American citizens on U.S. soil? If he accuses a guy in the Arizona desert or rural Montana of being an al-Qaeda terrorist, is it even kosher to send a drone over to blow him up, as was done to people overseas? Or is it never okay to drone strike an American citizen to death in America? It's an easy question. Answering it wouldn't jeopardize national security in any way. So why does the Obama administration keep officials dodging? Why do they keep dodging the question? When the president was asked this question at Google last week, he said, well, we might have different rules inside the country than outside the country. Well, that sort of assumes that he thinks he can kill Americans here, and he might have different rules, he might have more protections, but he's not going to tell you. He says it's secret. I, for one, am not very comforted. When the president says, oh, I haven't killed any Americans yet, and I don't intend to kill any Americans, but I might, that doesn't really comfort me so much. I don't think that's strong enough language. The presidential oath of office says, I will preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. It doesn't say, I intend to. It doesn't say, I intend to preserve if it's convenient. I intend to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution if it's convenient. In his memo, he says he's only going to kill people if it's infeasible. To me, that sounds a little bit like, yeah, it's tough, it's inconvenient. So I'm going to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution as long as it's feasible. It just doesn't really inspire me. Friedersdorf goes on to say, with regard to the president's answer at Google, that he couldn't give a straight answer. Counterterrorism advisor John Brennan, whose nomination we're talking about, won't answer either. He finally did answer, but only under duress. And his answer was actually the appropriate answer. He said the CIA can't do this in America. But Corda begs the question, because the CIA is not in charge of the drone program, the Department of Defense is, so we need an answer from the Department of Defense. And we get an answer from Eric Holder that says they haven't done it yet, they don't intend to do it, but they might. And doesn't say specifically that they won't. These answers have been out there for a while, and we've been through this and around this and asked for questions. And I think so much of this, these are simple questions. These are questions that I can't imagine why we can't get an explicit answer unless the answer is no. Unless the answer is that they don't want limitations on their power. Unless the answer is that they don't want to be constrained by the Constitution, unless their answer is that the Bill of Rights doesn't apply to them when they think it doesn't apply to them. And see, that's the real danger. Eric Holder, your Attorney General, was asked about this and asked about the Fifth Amendment, and he was asked, does it apply? And he said, well, it applies when we think it applies. What does that mean? Now, I know it is a debatable question overseas, American citizens, this and that, but I don't think it's a debatable question in our country. Does the Fifth Amendment apply? I don't know how you can argue the Fifth Amendment doesn't apply. I don't know how you can argue we have an exemption to the Bill of Rights when we want to. But this is the president, the same president who did argue that he gets to determine when the Senate is in recess. Because he didn't get a few of his appointees last year, he argued that the Senate was in recess and said he could appoint anybody he wanted. And he did. It went to court, and the court rebuked him. The court says, you don't get to decide all the rules for all of government. The Senate decides when they're in recess. You decide when you're in recess, but you don't get to decide the rules for the Senate. They struck him down, and has he obeyed the ruling? Has he listened to what the court did? Has he been chastised and rebuked by the court? The people that he appointed illegally are still doing that job. All of their decisions are probably invalid. So for the last 2 years or a year and a half, however long these recess appointments have been out there, all of these decisions, it's going to be a huge mess. They've made all these decisions, and it's going to be uncertain whether the decisions are going to be valid. All of this happens because for some reason he thinks he has power that he doesn't actually have. I think there are some analogies to what we're talking about here. Now, one of the things that the rules he said he would adhere to as far as the drone strikes overseas was that there has to be an imminence to the threat. But then his team of lawyers follow up and conclude, well, it has to be imminent, but it doesn't have to be immediate. And I think only a gaggle of government lawyers could come together and say that imminent doesn't mean immediate. Spencer Ackerman wrote in Wired about this, and the title of this is How Obama Transformed an Old Military Concept So He Can Drone Americans. Imminence used to mean something in military terms, namely that an adversary had begun preparations for an assault. In order to justify his drone attacks on American citizens, President Obama redefined the concept of imminence to exclude any actual adversary attack. It's important to get that and to register that. He has defined a potential imminent attack to mean that it excludes any actual adversary attack. So you're under imminent attack, but there is no attack. I mean, it is a bizarre logic, but it's done to widen what they can do to grant them more power. Ackerman goes on, he says, this is at the heart of the Justice Department's newly leaked white paper. These are these drone memos. It was first reported by NBC News, explaining why a broader concept of imminence trumps traditional constitutional protections American citizens enjoy from being killed by their government without due process. It's an especially striking claim when considering that the actual number of American citizens who are senior operational leaders of al-Qaeda is a vanishingly small number. As much as Obama talks about rejecting the concept of perpetual war, he's providing and institutionalizing a blueprint for it. This is what we're talking about. Don't think that if you give the president the power to kill Americans, that it's a temporary power. The use of authorization of force, they say, has no geographic limit and no temporal limit. There is no end to the war. There is no end to the lessening or the abrogation or the giving up of your rights. If you give up your rights now, don't expect to get them back. Ackerman goes on. Imminence has always been a tricky concept. It used to depend on observable battlefield preparations like tanks amassing near a front, missile assemblage, or the fueling of fighter jet squadrons. Even under those circumstances, there was little consensus internationally about various wars that we've had in the past. President George W. Bush contended that the U.S. had to invade Iraq not because the government knew Saddam Hussein was about to launch an attack on America, but because it didn't, because it was unknown, because we fear things we don't know, so we conclude yes, and we preemptively attack. Bush contended that the uncertainty about Saddam's weapons of mass destruction, augmented by 9/11 warnings of shadowy terrorist groups plotting undetectable attacks, redefined imminence. So when I say this is not a partisan battle, I'm true to my word. President Bush started this. President Obama is expanding this. The real irony, though, is President Obama ran as the anti-Bush candidate. He ran as the guy with the real moral umbrage at what President Bush was doing, and in the end, he's taking presidential power to a new level beyond what President Bush could have ever imagined. So Bush contended that they could invade because they were uncertain about what Saddam could do. He redefined imminence to mean the absence of dispositive proof refuting the existence of an unconventional weapons program. Imminence is the absence of proof that you don't have something. So you have to prove a negative, you have to prove you don't have something, or you are an imminent threat. That'd be sort of like saying to Mexico, prove to us you don't have a nuclear weapon or we're going to bomb Mexico City. It's a bizarre notion of imminence. So Mexico's now an imminent threat to the United States because they are unwilling to prove they don't have a nuclear weapon. You can see the convoluted logic that occurs here. When U.S. troops invaded, they learned that Saddam did not possess what Bush or Condoleezza Rice famously termed a smoking gun that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud. The undated Justice Department white paper, a summary of a number of still classified legal analysis, redefines imminence once again. Al-Qaeda leaders are continually planning attacks, the undated white paper says, and so a preemptive attack does not require the United States to have clear evidence that a specific attack on U.S. persons and interests in the immediate future. Well, realize what this means. First of all, nobody's got an Al-Qaeda card. I think we say every terrorist in the world is in Al-Qaeda because then they've got to prove otherwise. So nobody's got an Al-Qaeda card. Everybody's in Al-Qaeda. So we say that unless you can prove that you're not attacking us, because we know the history of Al-Qaeda is to continue to attack us, we can preemptively attack you. But now we're talking about bringing that kind of gobbledygook, jumbled logic to the United States. Are these going to be the standards by which we kill Americans? Ackerman goes on, for an adversary attack to be imminent and a preemptive U.S. response justified, U.S. officials need only incorporate considerations of the relevant window of opportunity, the possibility of reducing collateral damage, and the likelihood of heading off future disastrous attacks on America. So if we say Al-Qaeda is always attacking us, and we say you're part of Al-Qaeda, then we can kill you. But the thing is that that's an accusation. If you're a U.S. citizen, you live in San Francisco or Houston or Seattle, and someone says you're a member of Al-Qaeda, shouldn't you get a chance to defend yourself? Shouldn't you get to go to court? Shouldn't you get a lawyer? Are these not things that we would want in our country? Ackerman goes on. He says, there's a subtlety at work in the Justice Department framework. It takes imminence out of the context of something an enemy does and places it in the context of a policymaker's epistemic limitations. So really, we're not looking to say someone's got a rocket launcher on their shoulder. We're saying because we think that these people don't like us and will continue to attack us, that we can preemptively kill them. Realize that this kind of logic's being used overseas, and that's debatable. But now they're going to bring this logic to America. So when you read stuff like this, that imminence is out of the equation, and in its place, we're going to put a policymaker's epistemic limitations or estimations. That's how we're going to decide who's going to be killed in America. All we know is what we have in the foreign drone program. We have no evidence yet because no one's told us. They've just told us they haven't killed anyone yet. They don't intend to, but they might. But they haven't told us what the rules are that they're going to use in this context. What rules are going to be used in America? If you're going to kill non-combatants, people eating dinner in America, there have to be some rules. Does the Constitution apply? But when Eric Holder was asked about the Fifth Amendment, he says the Fifth Amendment applies when they think it applies. He says the executive branch is very careful, and they're very conscious of the Fifth Amendment, and they do try to apply the Fifth Amendment when they can. Well, I mean, it's a different story if you're talking about a war overseas and you're talking about people who live in our country. You don't get the option of determining when the Fifth Amendment applies. Ackerman goes on to say, if there's a reasonable debate over what imminence means in the era of terrorism and what standards ought to be accepted for defining it as an international norm, this framework where they talk about that they're thinking about what the terrorist is doing rather than what the terrorist is doing basically preempts the whole idea of determining or trying to discuss or figure out what imminence really means. Ackerman goes on, all that matters to justify a drone attack is for the U.S. to recognize that it can't be all-knowing. So interestingly, it's not intelligence that drives the attack, it's you saying, I don't know, but I am worried that these people do attack us continuously. So by me not knowing their plans, that is a justification for an attack. Realize that could be the standard in the United States. It's the logical equivalent of the CIA's signature strike, which target anonymous military-age males in areas where terrorists operate. This should be the thing that should just scare the you-know-what out of you. If we are killing people overseas who we don't know their name because we think they're in a caravan going from a place where we think they're bad people to to another place where there are bad people. That's a fairly loose standard. So let's say there are people going from a Constitution Party meeting to a Libertarian Party meeting. Both these groups don't like big government. They hate big government. They're opposed to government. They're nonviolent as far as I know, but they were on the fusion list for potential terrorists. Are we going to kill people in a caravan going from one meeting to the next? Are we going to have to name the person we kill in the United States? You say, oh, that's absurd. We would never do that. Well, what about whose phone we tap? Do we have to name that person? It used to be the requirement. It's gotten less so over time. We've gotten to the point where the Fourth Amendment protections to name the person, place, and what you want to look at have become looser over time. So I think it's a legitimate question. If you're going to target Americans on American soil, are you going to name them first? Are you going to tell us who's on the list? The list overseas is secret. So the question is the list going to be secret in the United States? How do you get your due process if you don't know you're on the list? It's a little bit late after the drone attack to say, hey, it wasn't me. I didn't really mean what I said in that email. I shouldn't have made that comment online. Some liberals, I think, have had a double standard in this and haven't been very good. Some have been more honest in their criticism of the president for being hypocritical. The president seemed to be concerned at one point in time about warrants for wiretaps. He seemed to be concerned about Americans and torture. He seems to have lost a little bit of that when we talk about whether or not to kill Americans on American soil. Eugene Robinson, who I would consider a liberal pundit, writes an article that was printed in the San Antonio News, and it's called Judicial Review Needed for Drone Hits of Citizens. He begins this way. He says, if George W. Bush had told us that the war on terror gave him the right to execute an American citizen overseas with a missile fired from a drone aircraft without due process or judicial review, I'd have gone ballistic. These are Eugene Robinson's words. If he'd have heard this about George Bush, he'd have gone ballistic. And to his credit, he says, it makes no difference that the president making this chilling claim is Barack Obama. What's wrong is wrong. Robinson goes on to say, the moral and ethical questions posed by the advent of drone warfare are painfully complex. We had better start working out some answers because, as an administration spokesman told me recently, drone attacks are the new normal. In the ongoing struggle against terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda, these attacks have become normal. They've become commonplace. They've become the rule rather than the exception. But at least Eugene Robinson is someone who's consistent in his application of criticism. He says he would have gone ballistic had George W. Bush done exactly what President Obama is doing. And his response is, it makes no difference that the president making this chilling claim is Barack Obama. What's wrong is wrong. The question of when we get due process, whether or not it applies to you here or overseas, is a big question. But under our concept of government, it's not a question that should be left up to one branch of government. Should one branch of government get to decide that you don't get due process, that the Fifth Amendment doesn't decide to you? This is an incredibly important question. John Brennan and the nomination today pale in comparison to that question. Does the president alone unilaterally get to decide whether the Fifth Amendment applies to you? Or can he say that he's going to secretly accuse you of a crime and that the Fifth Amendment doesn't apply to you? Now, this is worrisome because the Attorney General has been asked about the applicability of the Fifth Amendment to the drone program. He said the Fifth Amendment applies when they think it applies. He says they try to give some kind of process. It's not due process. Due process involves a jury and a judge and a public trial and an accusation. By process, they mean they get together and look at a PowerPoint presentation, they go through some flashcards, and they decide who they're going to kill. That is the process. Now, they may say, oh, you're demeaning the process by treating it flippantly.